Welcome to Echoes of Holmes. Tonight, we enter the world of Sherlock Holmes in the affair of the merchant's testament, a dead merchant, a contested will, and secrets sealed behind a locked door. Where are you listening from? Light a candle, settle in, and let the mystery begin. It was on a raw and fog-laden morning in early November that I found myself once more at Baker Street, summoned by a brief but urgent note from Sherlock Holmes. The message, written in his brisk hand, stated only, "Come at once, Watson. A matter of inheritance most singular has been placed before me. S.H." Such cryptic summonses from my friend were hardly unusual, yet the phrase most singular carried with it an intonation of mystery that stirred my curiosity. Upon arriving, I discovered Holmes in the sitting-room, standing before the fireplace with his long, nervous fingers steepled beneath his chin. His grey eyes, sharp and luminous, fixed themselves upon me the moment I entered. On the table lay a heavy parchment document, its seal already broken, and beside it a small stack of papers scrawled in hasty script. "You are just in time, Watson," Holmes remarked, without preamble. "Our visitor has but now departed, leaving us with what I dare say may prove a most intricate affair. It concerns the last testament of one Mr. Jonathan Aldridge, a prosperous merchant of the city, recently deceased, under circumstances that, while not overtly criminal, bear peculiarities which I find irresistible." Holmes gestured toward the parchment. "The will, as you see, was executed scarcely 3 weeks prior to his death, and it has already become the subject of fierce dispute. His only surviving daughter, Miss Clara Aldridge, claims that her father was coerced into altering it. The chief beneficiary is, curiously enough, not his kin, but his business partner of 30 years' standing, Mr. Felix Mortimer. I seated myself, struck at once by the human drama that must underlie such a contest. But surely, Holmes, quarrels over wills are common enough. Why should this case attract your attention?" "Ah!" Holmes's lips curved into a faint smile. "Because, my dear Watson, Aldridge was known for his probity. His affection for his daughter was well established. Yet he has disinherited her almost entirely, leaving her with a mere annuity while bestowing the bulk of his estate upon Mortimer. More curious still, the document bears certain irregularities in phrase and construction which, though perhaps invisible to the untrained eye, are as glaring to me as footprints across fresh snow." At that moment, a knock sounded upon the door. Mrs. Hudson entered with a card upon a salver. Holmes glanced at it and raised his brows. "Inspector Lestrade," he murmured, "so the yard has already been drawn into this affair. Capital. We may hear what angle of criminality they perceive." A moment later, the familiar, wiry figure of Lestrade entered, his countenance marked by both satisfaction and perplexity. "Good morning, Mr. Holmes," Dr. Watson said, settling his hat upon the table. "I thought I should bring this matter to your notice, though I find myself of 2 minds about it. Aldridge's death was certified natural heart failure, they say, but the quarrel over this will is already causing no small stir in the city. There's talk of forgery, of fraud, of underhanded means. And now," he leaned forward, "one of Aldridge's clerks has disappeared without trace, and he was last seen handling papers from the merchant's safe." Holmes' eyes gleamed as he turned back to me. "You see, Watson? Already the shadows lengthen. What begins as a dry matter of probate may conceal beneath its folds the darkest intrigues. We must tread carefully, for behind every clause of this testament may lie a motive strong enough to kill." Holmes reached for his violin and drew the bow across the strings, producing a long, low note that trembled in the fog-laden air of Baker Street. "Yes, Lestrade, I shall look into your merchant's testament, for here, I suspect, lies more than the law courts or probate registry will ever reveal. Pray, Watson, fetch your coat. We shall first call upon Miss Clara Aldridge, whose grief and suspicions may afford us the opening of the trail. And thus began one of the most curious affairs ever to engage the mind of my friend Sherlock Holmes. The fog had thickened by the time Holmes, Lestrade, and I set forth from Baker Street, so that the hansom cab into which we bundled ourselves creaked along like a ship steering through grey waters. London seemed muffled, its clamour dampened by the mist. Street lamps flared dimly, and the silhouettes of pedestrians passed like phantoms, their outlines vanishing into gloom. Holmes remained silent for much of the journey, his head bent forward, fingertips pressed together in that meditative pose which I had come to recognize as the precursor to revelation. Lestrade, meanwhile, shifted uneasily in his seat, clearly impatient with Holmes's contemplative quietude. "You know, Mr. Holmes," said Lestrade at last, "I don't see what you expect to find in all this. Aldridge was an old man, past 65, with a history of heart trouble. He dies suddenly, as might be expected. The will favours his partner Mortimer, perhaps unjustly, but still within a man's rights. What's there to investigate?" Holmes' eyes flickered upward, and a faint, sardonic smile played upon his lips. "My dear Lestrade, the commonplace is ever your refuge. But consider, why should a man known for his honesty alter his will in such a manner, leaving his only daughter in penury while enriching one who, though a trusted partner, was neither blood nor ward? Why should the clerk who last handled Aldridge's safe vanish the very week the will is disputed? No, events march in step, and it is for us to discern their rhythm." Lestrade grunted, unconvinced, but said no more. At last the cab drew up before a tall, dignified house in Bloomsbury Square. The gate shutters were drawn, and a heavy air of mourning hung about the place. A maid admitted us, leading us into a drawing-room where Miss Clara Aldridge awaited. She was a young lady of perhaps 25, plainly dressed in black, but of a bearing that spoke to education and refinement. Grief had left her pale, but her gaze was steady, almost defiant, as she rose to receive us. "You are Mr. Sherlock Holmes," she said, her voice composed, though tinged with sorrow. "I am grateful that you have come. I scarcely know whom to trust, for already I am beset by lawyers and relatives who would have me yield quietly. But I cannot believe my father acted of his own accord. He loved me too dearly." Holmes bowed with unusual courtesy. "Your father's character is well known to me, Miss Aldridge, though I never had the pleasure of meeting him. You say you doubt the authenticity of his testament. Tell me, what foundation have you for such doubts?" She clasped her hands tightly together. "The very night he signed it, I remember he seemed troubled. He retired early, yet twice I heard him pacing his room. The next morning he spoke to me with unusual tenderness, as though something weighed heavily upon him. And though the lawyers assured me all was proper, I cannot rid myself of the conviction that he was forced, perhaps deceived, into the change. Holmes's keen eyes missed nothing. And Mr. Mortimer, how would you describe his relations with your father?" "Respectful, always," she replied. They had worked together for decades, but of late she hesitated. I fancied there was a coolness between them, though I cannot say why. Holmes leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled. "You have rendered the situation with admirable clarity. Might I trouble you to produce a sample of your father's earlier handwriting? A letter, perhaps, or an earlier draft of his testament?" "Certainly." She withdrew briefly, returning with a small bundle of correspondence. Holmes examined them with care, his eyes darting back and forth with hawk-like precision. At length he set them aside. "Thank you, Miss Aldridge. I shall reserve my conclusions for the present. Tell me, Who else benefits under the new will besides Mr. Mortimer? Only his nephew, Henry Mortimer, who inherits a small property outside the city. None of the rest of the family are mentioned indeed. Holmes's tone was reflective. And this missing clerk of your father's, what can you tell me of him? She frowned. That is Mr. James Elwood. He was diligent, though quiet, in my father's employ for nearly 10 years. I saw little of him, save that he was always prompt and exacting. I cannot believe he would abscond with anything, Lestrade interjected. Yet absconded he has, miss. He left his lodgings without notice, and no trace of him has been seen these past 3 days. That looks black, you must admit. Holmes' gaze turned sharp. Appearances, Lestrade, are treacherous allies. For my part, I see no proof of flight, only of absence. Until we learn what papers he carried from the safe, we are still groping in the shadows. At that moment, the door opened, and a servant announced Mr. Felix Mortimer. The gentleman who entered was of middle years, florid of face, with a frame that suggested both wealth and indolence. His manner was affable, almost too affable, as he greeted Miss Aldridge with a show of sympathy before bowing to us. "Ah, Mr. Holmes, I had heard you were consulted, though I must confess I scarcely see the necessity. My dear partner's will is in perfect order, witnessed and sealed by reputable solicitors. Surely we must not dishonour his memory with unnecessary suspicions." Holmes' voice was soft but edged with steel. "And yet, Mr. Mortimer, those suspicions exist. A sudden alteration of testament, the disinheritance of a devoted daughter, a missing clerk, these are hardly the ingredients of tranquillity. You will forgive me if I probe further." Mortimer's geniality faltered, and a flicker of unease crossed his features. Of course. I have nothing to conceal. Pray ask what you will." Holmes inclined his head slightly, but asked nothing further, content instead to let silence work its pressure. Mortimer shifted in his seat, then rose, protesting a prior engagement. After he departed, Holmes turned to us with a faint, sardonic smile. "A man too anxious to appear unconcerned, Watson. Mark that well." Miss Aldridge's eyes followed Mortimer with quiet resentment. "I knew it. He has schemed against me, but how could he bend my father to such a course?" "That," Holmes replied, "is the very heart of our problem. Fear not, Miss Aldridge, I shall endeavour to discover it." As we departed, I asked Holmes whether he truly suspected Mortimer of coercion. "My dear Watson," said he, drawing his cloak close to him against the chill, "I suspect nothing. I observe. Mortimer's manner betrays anxiety. Aldridge's handwriting reveals inconsistency. A clerk vanishes with papers, and yet none of these pieces, taken alone, compel belief. It is in their union that truth will emerge. Tomorrow we shall examine Aldridge's office and safety. There, I trust, lies the first clear step upon our path. The hansom bore us back into the misty labyrinth of London, and I confess my mind was already alive with conjectures. For if Holmes's instincts proved correct, this was no mere quarrel of probate, but the shadow of a deeper intrigue, whose contours we had but barely glimpsed. The following morning broke clearer than the last, though the November air still carried a damp chill that crept beneath one's coat. Holmes was already astir when I descended to breakfast, his keen eyes bright with that restless energy which always presaged the serious pursuit of a case. He had eaten little, but his pipe smoked furiously upon the mantelpiece, and his violin lay discarded upon the chair, mute witness to a night of wakeful meditation. "Come, Watson," said he, rising briskly, "the game is afoot. We must visit the late Mr. Aldridge's offices in Threadneedle Street. If my conjectures are correct, we may find both the key to Mortimer's ascendancy and the cause of Mr. Elwood's disappearance." Lestrade was waiting for us outside in a cab, his sharp features betraying impatience. Together we rattled eastward through the bustling streets, the cries of hawkers mingling with the rumble of drays and the clatter of hoofs upon the stones. Presently the grandeur of the bank loomed into view, and a short turn brought us to Aldridge and Mortimer, a respectable house of business whose brass plate gleamed soberly upon the door. A clerk received us, leading us through a warren of counting rooms filled with the scratch of pens and the rustle of ledgers. At length we entered a panelled office of some dignity, plainly Aldridge's own, now unoccupied, save for the dust of disuse since his death. A large mahogany desk stood near the window, a heavy safe was built into the far wall, and shelves laden with ledgers and merchants' books lined the room. Holmes stood quite still for several moments, his gaze travelling slowly about the chamber. His nostrils flared slightly and his eyes narrowed, as though the room itself whispered some private confession. Then, with a sudden darting motion, he crossed to the desk and examined its surface with a lens he had produced from his pocket. "Watson," he murmured, "observed here the faint smear of sealing wax upon the wood, yet no stick of sealing wax lies upon the premises. Curious. And here note the impression of a ring pressed into soft wax, though the document itself is absent." Aldridge was thorough. He would never have allowed such an irregular signet to pass unaccompanied. Lestrade, who had been shuffling papers impatiently, snorted. "A ring mark and a smear of wax. Hardly proof of conspiracy, Mr. Holmes." Holmes merely smiled, his eyes gleaming. The smallest grain, Inspector, may tip the scales when placed in its proper context. Let us proceed to the safe. The heavy door swung open at the clerk's touch, revealing a neat array of documents, bonds, and correspondence. Holmes bent low, his fingers dancing lightly across the shelves. At last he paused before an empty slot, his expression sharpening. "You will perceive, Watson, that the dust upon these shelves is disturbed only in one compartment. There is space for a single folio, recently withdrawn. The missing clerk, Elwood, was last observed with papers from this very safe. It does not require great imagination to suppose that this folio was his burden." "Then he has stolen it!" cried Lestrade triumphantly. Holmes shook his head. "Not so fast. If theft were his object, why vanish openly, leaving every other document untouched? No, there is some other reason, perhaps compulsion, perhaps fear. We must learn what this folio contained." He turned to the waiting clerk. "Pray, can you tell me what was stored here?" The man looked uneasy. "Sir, that was the file of correspondence between Mr. Aldridge and the foreign agents of the firm, the Hamburg house, chiefly, though also Antwerp and Marseille. Mr. Elwood was charged with arranging translations and ensuring accuracy." "Indeed." Holmes's eyes glittered. "Then we must inquire into Aldridge's continental affairs. There may lie the hidden spring of this business." As we left the office, Holmes lingered a moment by the door, his eyes fixed upon the carpet. He stooped, plucked a shred of torn paper from the pile, and slipped it into his pocket without a word. Outside, Lestrade grew restless once more. "I see nothing here beyond a clerk who took fright and bolted with papers he had no right to. Mortimer inherits by lawful testament, and the daughter imagines coercion because her pride is wounded." "I think you make phantoms of shadows, Mr. Holmes." Holmes laughed softly. "Shadows, Inspector, often conceal the substance itself. Let us not declare victory too soon. Our next step is clear. We must call upon Mr. Mortimer in his own offices and judges whether his composure withstands a sterner scrutiny." Accordingly, we set out for Mortimer's private chambers near Cornhill. These were luxuriously appointed with heavy curtains, a Turkey carpet, and walls adorned with oil paintings of ships and warehouses, mute testimony to his mercantile success. Mortimer received us with an air of injured dignity, protesting once again that Aldridge's will was properly drawn and witnessed. "Sir," said Holmes with that cold precision which always unnerved his opponents. "You are doubtless aware that a certain folio of correspondence is missing from your late partner's safe. What explanation do you have to offer?" Mortimer's florid face darkened. "I know nothing of any folio. Elwood was Aldridge's man, not mine. If he has stolen documents, he must answer for it. I have neither hand nor knowledge in the matter. Yet you benefit, Mr. Mortimer, by the removal of whatever doubt such documents might raise." Mortimer's composure cracked, and he leaned forward angrily. "Are you accusing me, sir?" "I accuse no one," said Holmes coolly. "I merely observe that the absence of certain papers and the sudden alteration of a testament are facts which bear examination. If you are innocent, Mr. Mortimer, you should welcome such scrutiny as will prove it." Mortimer muttered something under his breath and dismissed us shortly thereafter. Holmes, however, seemed in high spirits as we emerged once more into the busy thoroughfare. "Well, Watson," said he, "the plot thickens apace. We have a missing folio of foreign correspondence, a vanished clerk, a daughter disinherited against all expectation, and a partner whose temper betrays anxiety. It is a promising beginning." As we turned toward Baker Street, Holmes drew from his pocket the scrap of paper he had plucked from Aldridge's carpet. It was but a fragment bearing half a dozen German words in a cramped hand. Holmes studied it intently, then slipped it back. Translation work, Watson Elwood's duty. Yet why should Aldridge's dealings with Hamburg have any bearing upon a London testament? That, my friend, is the question which will lead us to the truth. That evening, as we sat once more before the fire of Baker Street, I recorded my notes of the day's proceedings, while Holmes played soft, reflective strains upon his violin. He paused at length, gazing into the flames with a faraway look. "There is a pattern here, Watson, though it glimmers but faintly. A will altered, a folio gone, a clerk vanished. We stand as ever at the outer circle of the maze. Tomorrow we must trace Elwood's movements on the day of his disappearance. There lies the path inward." And with that, Holmes laid down his violin, his lips pressed into a thin line of determination. I confess that my own curiosity was now whetted to its keenest edge, for never had I seen a case which promised more of tangled motive and subtle deception than this affair of the merchant's testament. The next day dawned grey once more, with a sullen sky and a drizzle that slicked the pavements. Holmes, however, greeted the morning with unconcealed vigour. A telegram lay upon the breakfast table, its paper crumpled where his long fingers had already perused it. "Elwood, Watson," he said, tapping the sheet with relish. "A trace at last." The lad was seen leaving his lodgings on Tuesday evening, in the company of a man described as tall, broad-shouldered, and wearing a bowler. They took the road toward the docks. The innkeeper's wife swears to it. Our vanished clerk did not vanish alone. Lestrade, who had joined us early, rubbed his hands. "That's the accomplice, mark my words. A confederate who spirited him away, and most likely the papers, too. If we catch them near the docks, the whole puzzle may unravel." Holmes's expression betrayed amusement. The inspector is ever eager to close his net, yet recall, Lestrade, that accomplices may themselves be pawns. Let us not assume what remains unproved. We shall visit the lodgings first. James Elwood's quarters were modest lodgings in a narrow street off Fenchurch. His room bore evidence of sudden departure, a trunk half-packed, a few garments left strewn about, and on the table a half-written letter in German, its ink still faintly smudged. Holmes examined it minutely. "Observe, Watson," he said, pointing with his lens. "The hand is Aldridge's, not Elwood's, yet it is being copied. This sheet is a practice exercise, likely by Elwood, to ensure faithful reproduction. Such imitation suggests that the correspondence folio contained documents in Aldridge's own script which Elwood was required to translate or duplicate. That introduces the possibility of forgery. "Forgery?" I exclaimed. "Indeed. But whether it was Elwood forging under duress or uncovering a forgery already committed remains to be seen." Holmes pocketed the letter, his eyes roving the chamber until they fixed upon a faint smear upon the door-frame. He touched it lightly and then smelt his fingers. "Grease ship's grease unmistakable. Our dockside clue is corroborated. Elwood departed for the waterfront. From the lodgings we proceeded to the wharves, that labyrinth of warehouses and taverns where every shadow harboured suspicion. After a series of inquiries, we were directed to the Anchor's Rest, a rough establishment by the river. There the landlord recalled seeing a man answering Elwood's description in company with another burly fellow with a scar across his cheek. They drank little, spoke less, said the landlord. But I saw the young one pass a packet to the scarred man. Then they slipped out into the fog. Lestrade was triumphant. There you are. Elwood sells the papers and flees. Mortimer may be rich, but he is blameless. The real villain is Elwood. Holmes's reply was quiet, but cutting. Your reasoning is as rapid as it is flawed, Inspector. Why would Elwood sell documents and then vanish without profit? Why leave behind the trunk, wages, and all his effects? No was not fleeing, but being drawn. Nevertheless, suspicion against Elwood grew. In the city, whispers already circulated that the clerk had betrayed his employer's trust. Miss Aldridge, however, clung steadfastly to her faith in him, asserting that he lacked both the daring and the guile for such perfidy. Our next step carried us back to Mortimer's circle, for Holmes insisted upon speaking with the nephew, Henry. We found him at his club, a young man of some 30 years, sleek of dress and easy in manner. He received us with polite courtesy, but an air of faint condescension. "I do not quite see," he said languidly, "why my name should be dragged into this business. My uncle manages the firm. I have my own pursuits. If Aldridge chose to remember me with a small bequest, that is no crime." Holmes's gaze sharpened. "And yet you were acquainted with Elwood, were you not? Did you not once engage him to assist in translating certain correspondence of your own?" Henry coloured slightly. "A trivial matter, some German shipping notes." He was obliging enough. "But that was months ago. Still, you were seen in his company more than once near the very tavern where he disappeared," Holmes pressed. Henry's composure faltered. "I may have met him by chance, but surely you cannot think of me involved in his vanishing?" Holmes smiled thinly. "I think nothing, Mr. Mortimer. I only observe. That will suffice for the present." Outside, I could not restrain my questions. "Holmes, do you truly suspect the nephew?" His manner was evasive, but hardly criminal. "Ah, Watson, you made a mistake on me. Suspicion is a tool, not a verdict. The nephew's anxiety may conceal guilt or merely fear of entanglement. We must follow his movements more closely." The following day brought a curious development. Lestrade burst into Baker Street with the air of a man certain of triumph. "Elwood is found," he cried, "or at least his body. Dragged from the river near Rotherhithe, with weights tied about his ankles. There's your thief unmasked. He tried to flee, and the current claimed him." Holmes sprang up, his eyes blazing. "Nonsense, Inspector. Suicide, is it? A man binds his own ankles with iron weights? Nothing is murder, as plain as daylight. And whoever wished Elwood silenced did so to prevent disclosure of a greater crime. The revelation cast a pall over us all. Elwood was no longer a suspect to be judged, but a victim whose silence deepened the enigma." Lestrade muttered, shaken in his certainty, while Holmes paced the room in fierce thought. "Watson," he said at last, "this affair grows darker. Elwood held knowledge dangerous enough to cost his life. The folio is gone, the will altered, the daughter disinherited. One hand orchestrates all. Whether it be Mortimer, his nephew, or another yet unseen, I cannot yet declare. But rest assured, the net is tightening. That evening, Holmes sat long at the fire, his violin neglected beside him. His gaze was inward, his mind working with that silent intensity which I had learned never to interrupt. Only once did he speak, and then more to himself than to me. The ring mark in wax is the foreign correspondence of the anxious partner, and now a murdered clerk. Yes, Watson, we are still amidst false trails, but the true path is there, faint as yet, waiting for the step that will reveal it. I laid down my pen, aware that though we had gained much knowledge, our certainty was less than ever. Elwood's fate had shifted suspicion from his shoulders, yet with it came darker implications. We stood at the brink of discovery, but the mist still concealed the figure behind the crime. The morning following the grim discovery of Elwood's body was one of bleak skies and leaden air. The fog had rolled back only to reveal a pall of smoke that hung low across London, as if the city itself were shrouded in mourning. I found Holmes already at his chemical table when I descended, sleeves rolled, his lean frame bent with intense concentration over a small slip of paper. "Good morning, Watson," said briskly. "Our unfortunate clerk has not left us entirely bereft. This scrap, which I retrieved from Aldrich's carpet, has yielded its secret." He handed me the fragment, where the cramped German words were now legible under the lens. "It appears," Holmes explained, "to be part of a ledger of shipments, timber consignments from Hamburg, all signed with Aldrich's name. Yet observe here this stroke, this flourish. Compare it to the authentic hand in Aldrich's earlier letters." I fetched the bundle Miss Aldrich had given us, and Holmes laid them side by side. Even to my untutored eye the difference was plain. The fragment bore a hand that strained at resemblance, stiff where the genuine script flowed easily. "It is a forgery," I murmured. Holmes inclined his head. "Precisely, and Elwood, whose duty was to translate such papers, discovered the forgery. That discovery, Watson, cost him his life. Lestrade, summoned once more to Baker Street, received the news with his customary scepticism. Forgery, you say? Perhaps. But who profits? Mortimer inherits by a lawful will, and these German ledgers concern trade, not estates." Holmes smiled thinly. "You grasp the matter by the tail, Inspector. Suppose Aldrich was presented with documents purporting to show losses abroad, or debts fabricated through forgery. Such would press a man of honour into desperate measures, perhaps even to alter his testament, under the guise of settling accounts with his partner. Mortimer, meanwhile, would stand enriched. Lestrade frowned, unconvinced, but Holmes pressed no further. Instead, he turned to me. "Watson, we must revisit Aldrich's house. I would examine the chamber in which he passed his last days. There, I believe, a trace remains that will confirm my suspicion." We found Miss Aldrich subdued, yet composed, her dark eyes steady as she admitted us once more. She watched in silence as Holmes conducted his singular search of her father's room. He moved with restless precision, pausing to examine the writing desk, the carpet near the bed, and even the ashes within the grate. At length, with an exclamation of satisfaction, he drew from beneath the blotter a small sheet, crumpled and torn. It bore Aldrich's own hand, hurried and uneven. Holmes smoothed it carefully and read aloud, "Cannot agree to such terms. To sign is to betray all. Yet if I resist, ruin follows. My child, forgive." The words ended abruptly, as if the pen had been dashed aside. Miss Aldrich clasped her hands to her breast, tears brimming in her eyes. He knew. He resisted. "Oh, Mr. Holmes, you must find the villain who forced this upon him." Holmes' expression softened for a moment, but he said little. He slipped the page into his pocket, then examined the grate with his lens. Among the ashes he discovered half-charred fragments of parchment bearing seals. He handled them delicately with his forceps. These, Watson, were drafts of the will burnt, yet not entirely consumed. Note here a clause bequeathing the estate wholly to Miss Aldridge, and here another naming both daughter and partner. Only in the final draft is Mortimer made sole heir. Aldridge was pressed to change his mind again and again until at last he yielded. The revelation silenced even Lestrade. Holmes straightened, his lean figure drawn taut with suppressed energy. "Gentlemen, the hand that forged the ledgers is the same that contrived to alter the testament. We stand not before a mere matter of probate, but a calculated scheme of fraud and intimidation." Miss Aldridge, though shaken, displayed admirable resolve. "Then you will expose him, Mr. Holmes? Will you clear my father's name?" Holmes bowed gravely. "It is my intention, madam. Yet patience is our ally. The edifice of deceit is seldom toppled in one blow. For now, let us keep this knowledge between ourselves." When we had withdrawn, Lestrade pressed Holmes. "If you believe Mortimer guilty, why not arrest him outright? The girl's note, the burnt drafts, the forged papersit is enough to hang him." "On the contrary," Holmes replied, "it is enough to acquit him, for no jury would convict upon such a fragile foundation. We require the missing folio. Within that lies proof undeniable. Until then, we must endure the inspector's prudence." Our path next led us to the Hamburg consulate, where Holmes, by dint of letters and his own formidable presence, secured access to shipping records. He perused them with swift intensity, making notes in his pocketbook. I watched him, baffled, as he muttered beneath his breath. Consignments doubled receipts, identical to a phantom trade. He closed the ledger with a snap. "Watson, these entries confirm it. Cargoes that never sailed, debts never owed, phantoms conjured by ink." Aldridge was ensnared, persuaded that ruin was threatened, unless he entrusted all to Mortimer. Elwood uncovered this and died for it. We returned to Baker Street by cab, Holmes silent the whole way, his brow furrowed in thought. That evening he remained restless, pacing the carpet, his violin untouched. At length he turned to me with sudden resolve. "Watson, the next step is perilous. I shall require a disguise and perhaps your revolver. We must seek the scarred man who met Elwood at the tavern. He holds the missing folio or knows who does. Without it, our case is but smoke." "And how shall we find him?" I asked. Holmes's smile returned, thin and cold. "By going where honest men fear to tread. The riverside taverns are a nest of rogues, but one rogue cannot conceal himself forever. I shall flush him out, as a hunter flushes the fox." Thus the stage was set for a darker pursuit. We had at last uncovered the first true inconsistency, the secret clue of forgery, but it had only sharpened the danger. Elwood's fate warned of the peril awaiting those who probed too far. And yet, as always, Holmes pressed forward, relentless in his pursuit of truth, while I followed with a heart divided between admiration and dread. 2 nights later, under the cloak of a chill November fog, Holmes drew me once more into the darker recesses of London's riverside quarter. He had exchanged his usual attire for the rough garb of a dock labourer's frayed cap, coarse jacket, and boots worn near to splitting. With a smudge of soot across his cheek and a slouch to his posture, he might have passed unnoticed among the roughest company. "For once, Watson," he said with a twinkle beneath his disguise, "your revolver may serve us more than your stethoscope. We hunt a scarred wolf among wolves, and such beasts do not bare their throats gently. The Anchor's Rest, where Elwood had last been seen, was thick with pipe smoke and the reek of ale. Sailors, stevedores and watermen crowded its benches, their voices raised in coarse laughter. Holmes guided me to a corner where we might observe without drawing notice. His gaze swept the room with hawk-like precision. "There," he murmured. A burly man with a scar slashed across his left cheek sat near the bar, his heavy fist clenched about a pewter mug. His eyes, shifty and watchful, darted about the room. Holmes rose and drifted closer, adopting the swagger of a dockside ruffian. Presently he struck up conversation, first with the landlord, then with those at the bar, until at length he drew the scarred man into the circle. I could not catch all that passed, but the fragments told of ships, cargoes, and a packet delivered. Holmes feigned drunkenness, leaning close, his voice low. The scarred man laughed harshly and slapped his knee, boasting of some fool clerk who had thought himself clever. My heart quickened, for I knew the topic must be Elwood. Suddenly the man grew cautious, his eyes narrowing. He rose abruptly, muttering, and strode toward the door. Holmes followed without hesitation, motioning for me to keep close. We spilled into the fog-bound alley. The man quickened his pace, then broke into a run. Holmes darted after him with the swiftness of a greyhound, while I laboured behind. The pursuit wound through twisting lanes and over slick cobbles until at last the scarred man stumbled into a cul-de-sac. He turned with a snarl, drawing a knife that gleamed in the gaslight. Holmes advanced steadily, unflinching. "Drop it!" Holmes commanded, his voice now stripped of all pretense. "You will not escape me, Mason." The man's eyes widened in recognition. "Holmes!" he spat. "Damn your clever eyes!" He lunged, but before steel could meet flesh, I fired a warning shot. The crack echoed, and Mason faltered. In the next instant, Lestrade and 2 constables, summoned by Holmes beforehand, rushed in to seize him. "Well played, Watson," Holmes said calmly, as the knife clattered to the ground. "Your aim remains as steady as your heart." From Mason's pockets the constables drew forth a leather folio, bound with ribbon, water-stained but intact. Holmes received it with a gleam of triumph, though his expression darkened as he leafed quickly through its pages. "Just as I thought," he murmured. "False invoices, forged receipts, and Aldridge's name affixed to all. This is the weapon by which Mortimer bent his partner to ruin. Mason here was the courier, and I suspect the murderer of poor Elwood." Mason growled but refused to speak further, even as he was dragged away. Yet scarcely had we tasted triumph when new calamity struck. As we returned to Baker Street, a messenger awaited with a note for Holmes. He tore it open, his brows knitting. "Mr. Holmes, if you value the safety of your investigation, desist at once. The testament is no concern of yours. Interfere further, and those near you may suffer." A friend. I started to wake up. A threat. Do you think it's genuine? "Genuine enough," Holmes said grimly. "The hand is disguised, but the message is plain. Mortimer, or one acting for him, knows that we have touched the nerve. The stakes rise, Watson. When threats are issued, violence follows." That night Holmes was restless, pacing the sitting room like a caged panther. He spoke little, save to mutter fragments about double entries, phantom cargoes, and a trap half-sprung. At one point he paused by the window, gazing out into the fog. "I begin to see the outline, Watson. Mortimer and his circle contrived both testament and fraud. Elwood chanced upon the forgery and paid with his life. Now they would silence us in turn. Very well, let them try. I shall force their hand, but in my own manner." The following day proved Holmes' prediction correct. A second crime shattered any illusion that Elwood's death was an isolated act. Miss Aldridge herself was attacked while returning from church, a carriage drawing up suddenly, its occupants attempting to force her inside. Only the cries of passers-by drove them off. She arrived at Baker Street pale and shaken, yet resolute. "They will not frighten me into silence," she declared. "Mr. Holmes, you must unmask them, for they would as soon see me dead as robbed of my birthright." Holmes took her hand with rare gentleness. "Fear not, madam. They have overplayed their hand. By turning violence upon you, they reveal their desperation." The net tightens. When she had gone, Holmes turned to me, his features grim. "Do you see, Watson? They strike now at the innocent. The affair has passed from fraud to attempted abduction. It is no longer a question of wills and ledgers, but of life itself. Tonight I must act, or the next blow may fall more cruelly still." I watched him that evening, his disguise laid out upon the table, his revolver cleaned and loaded. He studied the folio again and again, tracing connections invisible to me, until at last he smiled with that fierce light which always heralded his boldest stratagems. "Watson," he said quietly, "the enemy believes themselves secure, but they forget one thing, that deception leaves a trail. I shall follow it to its end. Tomorrow we set the snare." Thus the stakes were raised. The case of a contested testament had transformed into a battle of wits against men willing to kill. Elwood's fate, the threat to Miss Aldridge, and the warning to Holmes all pointed to the same ruthless hand. I felt the chill of peril as never before, yet in Holmes's steady gaze I found assurance. Whatever dangers lay ahead, the master of deduction was resolved to meet them. The next morning broke cold and bright, the fog swept away by a biting wind from the east. Holmes was already dressed when I rose, his sharp features illuminated by the pale light streaming through the window. Upon the table lay a collection of articles most curious: a wig of iron-grey hair, a pair of gold-rimmed spectacles, a heavy frock-coat, and a ledger book stuffed with loose papers. "You rise late, Watson," said he with suppressed excitement. "While you slumbered, I have been arranging matters. Today we bait the trap." I rubbed my eyes, still heavy from a night of restless thought. "And what role am I to play in this?" "You, my dear fellow, are to accompany me as ever, though I must beg you to hold your tongue upon certain details until the proper moment. For the enemy listens at every corner, and even the most loyal lips may betray what the mind has not yet grasped." I agreed, though inwardly chafing at Holmes's secrecy. He dressed himself in the wig and coat, the spectacles completing a remarkable transformation into a scholarly-looking gentleman of middle years, perhaps a solicitor or city accountant. His voice, too, he altered, adopting a dry, precise tone that bore no resemblance to his usual vibrant inflections. "Capital," he declared, surveying himself in the glass. "Few would look twice at a weary man of accounts. Now, Watson, let us away." Our destination was once again the counting-house of Aldridge and Mortimer. There Holmes introduced himself, under the assumed name of Mr. Joseph Grimley, as a representative of a Hamburg shipping concern. He professed an interest in certain timber accounts, producing from his ledger a sheaf of documents the very forgeries Mason had carried, now annotated by Holmes with damning marginalia. Mortimer himself received us in his office, his face lined with the strain of recent days. He studied the papers with growing unease, his jovial facade slipping moment by moment. "These are most irregular, sir," Holmes pressed, his false voice crisp. "Duplicate consignments, inconsistent tonnage, and receipts which cannot be reconciled. Unless these matters are cleared, I must conclude that fraud has been practiced under your firm's name. You will pardon my frankness, but my clients brook no deception." Mortimer flushed scarlet. "Sir, I cannot explain. Doubtless Aldridge handled these matters himself." "Then we must inquire of Aldridge's executors," Holmes replied coldly. "For if fraud there be, it touches not merely commerce but the honour of your late partner's name." Mortimer sprang up in agitation. "No, that is, there must be some mistake. These matters can be settled privately without scandal." Holmes's eyes gleamed behind the spectacles. "I am not here to discuss privacy, but truth. You may either explain or produce the missing clerk, James Elwood, who I am told was concerned in these accounts." At this, Mortimer's hand trembled visibly. He stammered an excuse, rang for his nephew, and the interview ended in confusion. But once outside, Holmes removed his spectacles with a triumphant smile. "Did you note, Watson, the perspiration upon his brow, the trembling of his hand, the faltering in his speech? The man is cornered. He knows the game is nearly up. But have we proof enough?" I asked anxiously. "Not yet, but proof is forthcoming. Tonight, I expect our adversaries to make a move. They believe they have silenced Elwood and cowed Miss Aldridge. They will seek now to recover or destroy the incriminating folio. We must contrive to intercept them." And so it was that evening that we found ourselves ensconced in Aldridge's empty office, Lestrade and two constables concealed in adjoining rooms. The fog pressed thickly against the windows, muffling the sounds of the city. Holmes, stretched languidly upon a chair, seemed the very picture of repose, though I knew his nerves were strung taut as a violin string. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the creak of boards and the ticking of the office clock. At last, near midnight, the faint sound of a key turning reached our ears. The door creaked open and two figures slipped inside, Mortimer's nephew Henry and the scarred man Mason, now evidently sprung from custody through influence or corruption. Henry moved to the safe with practiced ease, while Mason kept watch. "Quickly now," whispered the nephew. "He says the papers are hidden here. Once they're burned, there's no evidence." But as the safe door swung wide, Holmes leapt to his feet, casting off his air of indolence. "On the contrary, gentlemen, the evidence is secure, and so are you." Lestrade and the constables burst from their concealment. Mason snarled and lunged, but was borne down by sheer weight of numbers. Henry, pale and trembling, surrendered at once. Mortimer himself was not among them, but Holmes seemed unsurprised. "The general never leads the charge, Watson. He sends his pawns forward to test the ground, yet their capture will suffice, for they will not suffer alone." The prisoners were removed, though Henry wept bitterly, protesting that his uncle had ensnared him in the scheme. Holmes watched him go with cold detachment. "There lies our misdirection, Watson," he said, when the room was once more our own. "We were meant to suspect the nephew was young, impressionable, foolish. Yet he is but the tool. Mortimer is the hand that guides. The final act must unmask him before all." As dawn broke over London, Holmes stood at the window of Baker Street, the folio spread upon the table behind him. "The climax approaches, Watson. Mortimer believes himself secure still, for the law demands more than suspicion. Very well, I shall provide more. By tomorrow night I shall draw him into the open, where no denial can avail him." I asked no further question, for I had learned that Holmes in such moods preferred the silence of preparation. Yet I could not shake the sense that the case, far from concluding, was only now reaching its most perilous stage. The stakes had risen beyond fraud and forgery. They now touched honor, family, and life itself. The day that followed our midnight vigil dawned with a strange stillness. A pale sun filtered weakly through the soot-stained panes of Baker Street, as though London itself waited in suspense. Holmes had not slept. He paced the sitting-room in ceaseless circuits, his long fingers clasped behind his back, his gaze fixed upon some inward calculation. The incriminating folio lay upon the table, its pages spread in ordered sequence, while beside it rested the half-burned drafts of Aldridge's will. "Watson," he said suddenly, halting before me, "our adversary grows desperate. Mortimer has already risked threats, abduction, and murder. With his nephew and Mason now in custody, his circle narrows. But a desperate man may act rashly, and it is our task to force him to do so in full daylight, where the law may seize him." "And how do you propose to accomplish this?" I asked. Holmes's eyes gleamed. "By giving him no choice. We shall summon all the players, Miss Aldridge, Mortimer, and the solicitor who witnessed the testament, into one room. There, before witnesses, we shall confront him with the tangled threads. He may deny, but his very denials will betray him. Lestrade shall stand ready to act the moment the mask slips." The scheme was bold, and I confess it filled me with unease. Mortimer was not a man to submit quietly, and the violence already shown gave cause for fear. Yet I knew better than to doubt Holmes when once his mind had fixed upon a stratagem. The summons were dispatched, and that evening we gathered at the chambers of Aldridge's solicitor, Mr. Pennington, a grey-haired, sharp-eyed gentleman of exacting demeanour. The room was a solemn one, lined with leather-bound volumes, and illuminated by a solitary lamp that threw long shadows across the table. Miss Clara Aldridge arrived first, her face pale but resolute. She greeted Holmes with quiet gratitude and took her seat, clasping her hands tightly together. Lestrade followed soon after, accompanied by two officers who remained discreetly in the background. Then came Mortimer. He entered with an air of affronted dignity, his florid face set in a mask of wounded innocence. "Really, Mr. Holmes," he said, lowering himself into a chair, "this charade grows tiresome. I am a grieving partner and heir, yet you hound me as though I were a felon." Holmes inclined his head politely, his voice calm. "If you are indeed innocent, Mr. Mortimer, then tonight will see your honour vindicated. If not, well, truth has a way of emerging when its strands are drawn together." Mortimer's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. Holmes began with measured steps. He laid upon the table the scrap of forged correspondence, the folio of false invoices, and the half-burned drafts of the testament. Each item he explained with meticulous clarity, his voice steady, his reasoning irrefutable. He demonstrated how Aldridge's handwriting had been imitated, how phantom shipments had been invented, and how Aldridge, believing ruin imminent, had been persuaded to alter his will again and again until, at last, Miss Aldridge was disinherited. Mortimer listened in silence, his jaw tightening with each revelation. At last he could no longer contain himself. He struck the table with his hand, all circumstantial. So a clerk copies a hand, so a will has drafted what of it? These do not prove me guilty. Holmes's eyes flashed. Then perhaps this will. Mason carried this folio to you, did he not? It bears not only false invoices, but your own initials appended in haste, upon the margin of 3 documents. Do you deny it? Mortimer started, colour draining from his face. I cannot speak to every mark. Perhaps Aldridge enough, Holmes cut in. Aldridge's own note, recovered from his chamber, speaks plainly. To sign is to betray all, yet if I resist, ruin follows. He resisted until the end, but you broke him. And when Elwood uncovered the truth, you silenced him in the river. Shall I proceed further? The silence in the room was absolute, save for Mortimer's laboured breathing. Then he laughed harshly, though it rang hollow. Fine words, Mr. Holmes, but no jury will convict upon them. You have no witness, no confession. Holmes's lips curved in the faintest of smiles. On the contrary, you have already supplied both. Mortimer sprang to his feet, but Lestrade and the constables moved swiftly, hemming him in. You will answer for this, Mortimer, said the inspector sternly. The courts will decide what a jury thinks of Mr. Holmes's evidence. But Holmes was not yet finished. He turned to Miss Aldridge, his tone softening. Your father's honour is preserved, madam. He was coerced, not corrupted. His true wish was for your welfare. Tears welled in her eyes, and she bowed her head. "I knew it," she whispered. "Thank God for your clarity, Mr. Holmes." Mortimer, seeing his position crumbling, made a sudden dash toward the door, but was seized and restrained. His mask of dignity was gone, replaced by snarling rage. "You meddling fool!" he spat at Holmes. "Had you left well enough alone, none of this would have touched you." Holmes regarded him with cold detachment. "Truth has a way of touching all men, Mr. Mortimer. You may snarl at it, but you cannot escape it." With Mortimer taken away under guard, the room seemed to exhale its tension. Miss Aldridge, though shaken, expressed her gratitude with quiet dignity. Mr. Pennington, the solicitor, shook his head gravely. "I confess, Mr. Holmes, I doubted you at first. But now the matter stands plain. It is a pity the courts must ever wait upon such patient unravelling." Holmes merely shrugged. It is the nature of courts to stumble where reason strides. Yet the work is not quite done, Watson, for though Mortimer stands exposed, there remain questions of accomplices, of motives behind his trade forgeries, and of how far the corruption extends. One does not weave such a web alone. As we left the solicitor's chambers, I could not suppress my admiration. "Holmes, you astonish me. You have unmasked the villain before our eyes, yet still you speak as if the case were incomplete." Holmes gave a short laugh. "My dear Watson, a web may have many strands. We have cut the chief thread, but others remain. Until all are traced, I cannot pronounce the matter." The night air was cold, and as we climbed into the waiting cab, I felt a strange mixture of relief and foreboding. Relief that Mortimer's guilt was plain, but foreboding that Holmes's work was not yet done. The affair of the merchant's testament still concealed its final mysteries, and I sensed that the most startling revelations were yet to come. Mortimer's arrest the night before might have seemed the conclusion to any ordinary case. Indeed, Lestrade was already congratulating himself in the newspapers, declaring the matter a triumph of Scotland Yard in cooperation with Mr. Sherlock Holmes. Yet when I woke that morning to find Holmes pacing with restless energy, I knew well enough that the affair was far from complete. "You see, Watson," he said, tapping the folio of false invoices, "this is not the work of a single hand. Mortimer was a merchant, not a forger. He lacked the skill to imitate Aldridge's writing so precisely, nor the access to continental ledgers that supplied the framework for the deception. No, there is a larger design, an organized fraud across borders. Mortimer was the English agent. But surely, I objected, his arrest will suffice. The will is exposed as coerced, Miss Aldridge restored to her inheritance, and the man guilty of Elwood's murder brought to justice." Holmes stopped short, his eyes flashing. "Brought to justice, Watson?" "Perhaps, but mark this: Mortimer attempted to flee when I confronted him, yet he uttered no word of confession. His rage betrayed fear, but not solitude. That man knows his allies remain at liberty, allies who may yet strike at Miss Aldridge or at us to keep their enterprise concealed." Even as he spoke, a knock came at the door, and Miss Aldridge herself entered, pale and troubled. In her hand she held a letter, crumpled as though from trembling fingers. "This came to me this morning," she said, her voice low. I hardly dare show it. Holmes took the sheet and read it swiftly. The message was brief, written in a coarse hand. "The truth is not yours to know. Cease your meddling, or you shall follow your father into the grave." I cried out in alarm, but Holmes only smiled grimly. "Just so, Watson. The spider stirs when its web is touched. This is not Mortimer's hand. He is already in jail. No, this comes from those who used him and who now fear exposure. They would strike terror into Miss Aldridge, but instead they have given us our trail." "Trail?" I asked. Holmes pointed to the paper. The ink is fresh, cheap, and German in make. See how it pools unevenly upon the fibres? This was written with a common Hamburg ink, imported but seldom sold in London save near the docks. We must follow it to its source. That afternoon we descended once more to the riverside quarter, Lestrade reluctantly in tow. Holmes's inquiries, carried out with quiet persistence, soon brought us to a dingy stationer's shop in Wapping, whose shelves bore the very brand of ink. The proprietor, a nervous fellow, admitted he had sold a bottle only the day before to a foreigner of swarthy complexion, who spoke with a German accent and gave the name of Kurtz. Kurtz, Holmes repeated softly, his eyes gleaming. The Hamburg correspondent mentioned in Aldrich's letters, "Watson, we have at last touched the foreign hand behind the fraud." But if Holmes exulted inwardly, he gave no outward sign. Instead, he instructed Lestrade to place a watch upon the shop and all the surrounding taverns. For 2 nights nothing occurred. Then, on the 3rd evening, word came that a man answering Kurtz's description had been seen in a secret conference with Mortimer's solicitor, Mr. Pennington. Holmes received this intelligence with satisfaction. "Ah, so the good solicitor is not as innocent as he appeared. No doubt he profited by ensuring the testament's legality while steering Aldrich toward ruin." This, Watson, is the final strand in the web. We arranged a discreet surveillance of Pennington's chambers. From our vantage across the street, we observed a cloaked figure enter after nightfall, his bearing furtive. Holmes's eyes gleamed in the lamplight. "Kurtz," he whispered. An hour later the door opened again, and Pennington himself emerged with his companion. They walked swiftly through the fog, unaware of our pursuit, until they reached a warehouse by the river. There they disappeared inside. Holmes touched my arm. "Now, Watson, we must be bold. Lestrade and his men will surround the place. Inside, we shall find the heart of this conspiracy." We entered cautiously, the constables spreading to cut off escape. The warehouse was dim, filled with crates and bales. At its centre stood a table littered with papers, maps, and account books. Pennington and Kurtz bent over them, their voices hushed but urgent. Holmes stepped forward, his voice ringing through the gloom. "Gentlemen, the game is over." They started violently. Kurtz managed to snatch the papers, but Lestrade's men rushed in, seizing him. Pennington paled, stammering denials, but Holmes was relentless. He seized the nearest ledger and held it aloft. "Here is proof enough, Lestrade. False cargoes, phantom debts, signatures forged in Aldrich's handball, traced back to Hamburg and Antwerp. Mortimer was but your puppet, Pennington. You and your foreign ally devised the fraud, and you used the will to secure the final prize. Aldrich resisted, and so you broke him. Elwood uncovered the truth, and so you drowned him. The circle is complete." Pennington collapsed into a chair, his composure shattered. Kurtz struggled fiercely, cursing in German until bound. The constables gathered the papers, which indeed bore evidence of vast fraud across 2 countries. As we returned to Baker Street in the early hours, Holmes sat back in the cab, his features pale with fatigue, but alight with satisfaction. "You see, Watson, how each thread leads to the next. Mortimer was the surface, but beneath lay a deeper conspiracy of pen and ink, greed and deception. Now the law shall deal with them all." I could not withhold my admiration. "Holmes, you have once again pierced the very heart of the matter. Yet tell me, was there ever any doubt in your mind that Mortimer was not the sole culprit?" Holmes gave a soft laugh. "Doubt, Watson? No, suspicion, yes." Mortimer's hand trembled, but it lacked cunning. The true spider was Pennington, weaving his web from the very chambers of the law, but no web is too fine to escape the eye of reason. Thus the case entered its final stage. Mortimer languished in jail, his nephew broken, Mason silenced, Pennington disgraced, and Kurtz awaiting extradition. Yet Holmes, ever cautious, would not pronounce the matter ended until all was laid bare before the courts. For, he said, gazing into the fire that night, truth is not complete until justice follows, and justice, though slow, is inexorable. The events of the following day stand out in my memory with remarkable clarity, for they brought to their close one of the most intricate and perilous cases that ever engaged my friend's faculties. Mortimer was already in jail, his nephew Henry under examination, Mason and Kurtz securely held, and Mr. Pennington, the once respected solicitor, broken by exposure. Yet it remained for Holmes to bind the threads together and present the tapestry of the crime in its entirety. It was at Scotland Yard that the gathering took place. Lestrade, determined to claim credit for the capture, had pressed for a formal interview with all the principals. Thus we found ourselves in a sombre chamber, at the Yard Mortimer in chains, his florid face pale and drawn. Pennington, his dignity gone, slumped in despair, Kurtz glowering with defiant silence, and Miss Aldridge seated at the far end, her bearing calm though her eyes betrayed emotion. Holmes stood at the centre, tall and commanding, every line of his lean figure vibrant with controlled energy. His violinist's fingers, now clasped behind his back, tapped lightly as he began. "Inspector, Miss Aldridge, and gentlemen," he said, his voice firm and resonant, "you have seen fragments of this affair, but it is only in their union that the true picture emerges. Allow me to present it in order." He paused, his gaze sweeping the assembly, before he continued. Jonathan Aldridge was a man of honour and probity, yet he was drawn into trade with continental houses that, unbeknownst to him, were already corrupt. His trusted solicitor, Pennington, entered into secret correspondence with Kurtz of Hamburg. Together they devised a system of phantom cargoes and false receipts, all designed to appear in Aldridge's accounts. These documents, forged in his hand by skilled imitators, gave the appearance that Aldridge's fortune was crumbling, while in truth the losses were imaginary. Faced with these apparent disasters, Aldridge was driven into despair. He believed himself on the brink of ruin, and under pressure altered his will, first in his daughter's favour, then in compromise, and at last leaving everything to his partner Mortimer, who had been persuaded that such transfer would preserve the firm from collapse. Thus the testament became the instrument of fraud, stripping Miss Aldridge of her rightful inheritance. Mortimer attempted to protest, but Holmes silenced him with an uplifted hand. "You, Mortimer, were the visible heir, but not the brain. You were manipulated, perhaps willingly, by Pennington and Kurtz. Yet your guilt lies in this: you profited by their scheme. And when conscience pricked you, you smothered it with avarice. You lent your name to the fraud, and when suspicion threatened, you sought to cover it with violence." Holmes turned, his eyes narrowing upon Pennington. "You, sir, were the true spider in the web. As solicitor, you had access to Aldridge's drafts, his most private thoughts, his very handwriting. You guided his pen, altered his clauses, and assured him all was legal. And when Elwood, the diligent clerk, stumbled upon the forgeries, you resolved to silence him. Mason, your hired thug, lured him to the tavern, took the folio, and flung him into the river with weights upon his ankles. It was murder, cold and deliberate." A murmur of horror rippled through the room. Miss Aldridge pressed her hands together, her eyes glistening with tears. Holmes's voice rang on. Kurtz, meanwhile, remained abroad, supplying the forged invoices and receiving the profits. Yet he grew bold enough to enter London, to threaten Miss Aldridge herself, and to maintain secret conferences with Pennington. That, gentlemen, was his undoing, for it placed him within reach of the law. He paced slowly, every word deliberate. The evidence is complete. We have the folio of forgeries, the burnt drafts of the will, Aldridge's own despairing note, the testimony of witnesses who saw Elwood with Mason, and the threats delivered to Miss Aldridge. Each alone might falter, but together they form a chain of proof unbreakable. The conspiracy is exposed from Hamburg to London, its actors laid bare. Lestrade, unable to restrain himself, struck the table with his hand. "By heaven, Mr. Holmes, you've done it again. Clear as day now, we shall have them all before the courts." Holmes inclined his head slightly, but his gaze remained fixed upon Mortimer. "You will observe, Inspector, that Mortimer is as much a victim as a villain. His greed blinded him, but the true malice lay elsewhere. I leave it to the law to judge how far his culpability extends." Mortimer muttered bitterly, but his shoulders slumped in defeat. Pennington said nothing, his face grey with despair. Kurtz cursed in his own tongue, defiance unbroken. Holmes turned last to Miss Aldridge. His tone softened, and there was a rare gentleness in his expression. "Madam, your father's honour is restored. He did not betray you of his own will. He was ensnared, coerced, and broken, but his heart was ever yours. The testament that disinherited you was no act of his affection, but the weapon of those who preyed upon his trust." Tears slipped down her cheeks, though she smiled faintly through them. "I thank you, Mr. Holmes. You have given me back my father's memory. That is worth more than any estate." Holmes inclined his head gravely, and for a moment even he seemed moved. Then he straightened, his manner brisk once more. "Inspector, the matter rests now in your hands. The courts will decide the measure of punishment. As for me, my task is complete." We returned to Baker Street in silence, the weight of the case heavy upon us both. At last Holmes threw himself into his chair, stretched his long legs before the fire, and lit his pipe. "You see, Watson," he said, exhaling a thin stream of smoke, "how a single irregularity, the smear of wax upon a desk, may lead one to uncover fraud, coercion, and murder. The smallest clue, rightly observed, may unravel the most complex of schemes." "And yet," I said, "you speak of it as though it were no more than an exercise." Holmes smiled faintly. "To me, Watson, every case is but a problem of logic, clothed in the garb of human passion. Solve the logic, and the passion reveals itself. But let us not dwell too long. The world is wide, and it will not be long before another problem presents itself for solution." With that he fell into silence, his gaze fixed upon the fire, while I set down the record of the affair of the merchant's testament, the case that had begun with a disputed will and ended with the unmasking of an international conspiracy. It was some days later that I found leisure to set down the concluding particulars of the affair of the merchant's testament, for events moved with a swiftness that left little time for reflection. The arrests of Mortimer, Pennington, Kurtz, and Mason were the talk of London. The newspapers, ever hungry for sensation, gave full columns to the international conspiracy of fraud and murder, though, as is so often the case, the Yard received the greater portion of the credit, with only a grudging acknowledgment of Mr. Sherlock Holmes's role. Lestrade himself was in high spirits, though I observed he never failed to adopt as his own those deductions which Holmes had so painstakingly wrought. "Teamwork, Dr. Watson," he said to me with unblushing confidence. "That is the secret of success." The Yard and Mr. Holmes shoulder to shoulder. Holmes, who overheard the remark, merely smiled faintly and made no rejoinder. The law moved with deliberate but sure steps. Mortimer, confronted by the overwhelming evidence, at last confessed to his part in the scheme. He maintained to the end that he had not intended Elwood's death, laying that crime at Mason's door, though Holmes showed convincingly that Mortimer knew well enough what fate awaited the unfortunate clerk. Mason himself, hardened and unrepentant, went to the gallows within the year. Pennington was struck from the rolls and sentenced to long years of penal servitude, his name a byword for corruption in the very profession that should safeguard honesty. Kurtz was extradited to Hamburg, where further charges awaited him. Thus the chief actors in that dark drama received their measure of justice. But of Miss Clara Aldridge it remains to speak, for it was she who had suffered most. With her father's honour cleared and her inheritance restored, she came to Baker Street to render her thanks. "Mr. Holmes," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "you have not only rescued me from poverty, but you have given me back the memory of my father unsullied. For that I can never repay you." Holmes, who stood with his back to the fire, inclined his head with unusual gentleness. "Madam, I ask for no payment. Your father was an honest man ensnared by dishonesty. To restore the truth was sufficient reward." She pressed my hand warmly and took her leave, and I confess that my heart was touched more deeply than I cared to admit. For though Holmes could dissect motives with surgical precision, he seldom allowed himself to dwell upon their human cost. When she had gone, I ventured to express my admiration. "Holmes, I cannot but marvel at the manner in which you disentangled the threads of this affair. From the merest smear of wax upon a desk you uncovered a plot that stretched across countries and claimed lives." He smiled, lighting his pipe. "A trifle, Watson, a trifle. It is but the application of logic to observed fact. The world is full of such trifles, only waiting for an eye that sees and a mind that reasons. The rest is inevitable." "You make it sound simple," I said with a laugh. "Yet I, who watched at your side, confess I saw nothing until the pattern was already complete." "On the contrary, you saw as much as I," he replied. "What you lacked was not vision, but method. Observation without inference is like a violin without a bow. It produces nothing. But enough, Watson. The case is concluded. Let us turn our minds elsewhere, for London teems with enigmas, and even now I fancy some curious problem awaits our attention. That evening, as we sat once more in our familiar chairs at Baker Street, the fire burning brightly and the sounds of the city muffled beyond the curtains, I could not help reflecting upon the strange course of the affair. A contested testament had revealed itself as the mask of international fraud. A loyal clerk had given his life for honesty. A daughter had regained both her fortune and her father's honour. And Holmes, with his unerring logic, had exposed the web in which they were, all entangled. For myself, I felt once again that mingled pride and humility which ever attends my companionship with Sherlock Holmes. Pride that I should stand beside such singular mind humility that I could never hope to emulate his genius. Holmes sat in silence, his thin face illuminated by the glow of the fire, his long fingers steepled before him. At length he spoke, almost to himself. Fraud, coercion, murder all, spring from the same seed, Watson, human greed. It is the simplest of motives, and yet it produces the most elaborate of crimes. There is nothing new under the sun save the manner in which men contrive to deceive one another. With that he fell silent again, lost in thought. I took up my pen to record the case, knowing that one day others might read and marvel at his powers. For me, the affair of the merchant's testament would remain not only a triumph of logic, but a reminder of the frailty of human honour and the brilliance of the man who defended it. And so the curtain fell upon that drama. Yet as I laid aside my notes and glanced at my friend, already absorbed once more in the play of his restless mind, I knew that before long another summons would arrive, another enigma beckon, and once again I should find myself drawn into the strange and fascinating world of Sherlock Holmes.